Welcome back to the channel. If you're fascinated by the hidden realities of history, you're in the right place. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future journeys into the past. Tonight we drift into one of the darkest and most mysterious corners of the medieval world, its prisons. Behind the thick stone walls of castles and city dungeons, far below the noise of markets and royal courts, thousands of people waited in darkness for their fate to be decided. But what truly happened once night fell inside these prisons? What did prisoners hear, feel, and experience when the torches burned low and the guards disappeared into the shadows? In this video we will step inside those cold underground chambers and uncover the haunting reality of medieval prisons after dark, the fear, the hunger, the sounds in the darkness, and the uncertainty that haunted every prisoner until morning. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's journey back in time to discover what really happened inside medieval prisons at night. Night inside a medieval prison was often the most terrifying time for the people locked behind its thick stone walls. Unlike modern prisons, these places were not designed for comfort, reform, or even long-term living. They were usually temporary holding places where individuals waited for their fate to be decided. Some prisoners were waiting for a trial that might come days, weeks, or even months later. Others were waiting for punishment that had already been decided but had not yet been carried out. A few hoped they might eventually be released if a fine was paid or if someone important agreed to intervene on their behalf. But many prisoners feared something far worse, because for them prison was only the final stop before execution. When the day ended and darkness settled over the castle, city, or fortress that held the prison, the mood inside those damp stone chambers changed dramatically. During the day there was at least some movement, some noise from guards walking the corridors, and sometimes a faint trace of light reaching the cells through narrow windows or iron grates. Prisoners could hear activity from the outside world, such as distant voices, horses in the courtyard, or the sound of people moving through the castle above. But when night arrived, most of those sounds disappeared, and the prison became a place of deep silence broken only by unsettling noises that seemed to echo endlessly through the underground halls. In medieval Europe, prisons were not part of a formal correctional system the way they are today. Governments and rulers did not usually plan to keep criminals locked up for years while they attempted to reform them. Instead, imprisonment was mostly used to hold people until their punishment could be carried out or until their legal situation was resolved. This meant prisons were often poorly maintained, overcrowded, and treated as little more than storage spaces for human beings who had fallen into trouble with the law or with powerful authorities. Because of this, prisoners rarely received regular care or supervision, especially once night arrived and the guards had little reason to pay attention to what was happening inside the cells. As evening approached in a medieval town or castle, daily life above the prison began to slow. Merchants closed their shops, servants finished their duties, and residents prepared for sleep. But below the ground, inside the dark chambers where prisoners were kept, a completely different experience was unfolding. Many prisoners dreaded the arrival of night because it meant they would soon be left alone with their thoughts, their fears, and the unpredictable behavior of the people locked around them. The dim light that might have entered the prison during the daytime faded away completely, leaving most cells in near total darkness. Torches were rarely placed inside the cells themselves because fire was expensive and dangerous in such confined spaces. Even in the corridors, guards sometimes allowed torches to burn low or extinguish entirely in order to save resources. As a result, the study found that the relationship between the two variables was not significant. Prisoners often spent long hours surrounded by darkness so thick that they could barely see the outlines of the people sitting only a few feet away from them. This darkness created an environment where imagination and fear could grow stronger with every passing hour. Small sounds that might seem harmless during the day became frightening when heard at night in an enclosed space. A shifting chain, a distant footstep, or the scratching of an animal behind the wall could make prisoners tense with anxiety. The human mind has always struggled with uncertainty, and medieval prisons were filled with it. Most prisoners had very little information about what would happen to them. Legal systems during the medieval period varied widely depending on the region, but many were slow, inconsistent, and influenced heavily by social status. A wealthy merchant or noble might secure release quickly through payment or connections, while a poor laborer accused of the same offense might remain locked in a dungeon indefinitely. Because prisoners rarely received clear explanations about their situation, they spent long hours wondering what their future might hold. Night made these thoughts even more intense. During the day, conversation with other prisoners or the occasional appearance of a guard might distract them from their worries. But when the prison quieted down and darkness surrounded them, their minds often returned to the same questions again and again. Some prisoners tried to remain hopeful. They imagined the possibility that their innocence would eventually be proven, or that someone outside the prison would come to help them. Others feared the worst, believing that every passing hour brought them closer to punishment or death. The uncertainty was especially terrifying because executions during the medieval era could occur quickly and without much warning. In some places, a prisoner might be taken from their cell early in the morning and led directly to the place of execution without ever having known the exact date beforehand. Knowing that this possibility existed made every night feel like it could be the last. For prisoners who were new to the experience, the first few nights were often the most difficult. Many had never been inside a prison before and were shocked by the harsh conditions. They might have been arrested suddenly in the marketplace, on the road, or even inside their own homes. After being brought to the prison and locked inside a cell, the realization of their situation slowly began to sink in. When night arrived and the last light disappeared, that realization often became overwhelming. Some prisoners spent their first night awake, listening carefully to every sound around them and trying to understand the environment they had been thrown into. Others struggled with panic or despair as they thought about their families, their unfinished work, or the life they had just lost. The emotional experience of imprisonment was just as powerful as the physical discomfort. Medieval societies were often tightly connected communities where reputation and honor played a major role in daily life. Being imprisoned could damage a person's standing in society even if they were eventually proven innocent. Prisoners knew that rumors might already be spreading about them outside the prison walls. Friends, neighbors, or relatives might assume the worst simply because they had been arrested. This added another layer of anxiety to the long nights spent inside a cell. In addition to emotional stress, prisoners also had to deal with the presence of other inmates who might be strangers, criminals, or even enemies. Medieval prisons rarely separated people based on the type of crime they were accused of committing. A person arrested for a small debt could find themselves sharing space with someone accused of violent robbery or murder. Because guards often reduced their presence during the night, prisoners were forced to rely on their own instincts to stay safe. Some formed alliances or friendships with fellow prisoners in order to protect themselves. Others remained quiet and isolated, hoping to avoid attention. Conversations sometimes filled the early hours of the night as prisoners shared stories about how they had ended up there. These conversations could provide a small sense of companionship in an otherwise lonely place. A prisoner might learn about distant towns, different crimes, or the harsh punishments that existed in other regions. But such conversations could also increase fear. Hearing about torture, execution methods, or brutal treatment in other prisons reminded everyone that the justice systems of the medieval world were often unforgiving. As the night continued and exhaustion slowly set in, some prisoners attempted to sleep despite the uncomfortable conditions. The floor beneath them was usually hard stone, sometimes covered with damp straw that had been used by previous prisoners. The air could be cold during winter nights or stifling during warmer seasons, depending on how deep the dungeon was and whether any ventilation existed. Even if a prisoner managed to fall asleep for a short time, they were often awakened by noise or movement from others around them. Because many prisoners were chained or confined in small spaces, every shift in position produced sound. The result was a restless environment where true rest was rare. For those who could not sleep, the night seemed endless. Time moved slowly when there was nothing to mark its passage except distant sounds or the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Some prisoners tried to measure time by counting their breaths or repeating prayers. Religion played a powerful role in medieval life, and many prisoners turned to faith for comfort during these long hours. Quiet prayers whispered in the darkness were common, as individuals asked for forgiveness, protection, or a miracle that might change their fate. Others simply stared into the darkness, lost in thought, waiting for the faint signs that morning might eventually arrive. The psychological pressure of these nights could be immense. Even strong individuals sometimes felt their hope weakening after many days of imprisonment. The lack of light, fresh air, and meaningful human interaction created a sense of isolation that was difficult to endure. Over time, some prisoners became quiet and withdrawn, speaking very little to those around them. Others reacted in the opposite way, becoming restless, angry, or desperate. Every person responded differently to the same harsh environment. The guards themselves often viewed the night shift as the least desirable part of their duties. Standing watch in a dark prison corridor could be boring and unsettling at the same time. As a result, guards sometimes spent long periods sitting in nearby rooms rather than walking constantly through the cells. This reduced supervision meant that prisoners were largely responsible for managing their own behavior throughout the night. For those locked inside, this absence of authority could feel both relieving and frightening. On one hand, fewer guards meant fewer immediate threats of punishment or interrogation. On the other hand, it also meant there was little protection if conflict broke out among prisoners. While the outside world slept peacefully in their homes, the prisoners remained trapped in a place where time seemed to slow and fear quietly spread through the darkness. Each night forced them to confront the same reality again and again. They had lost control over their own lives. Their freedom, their safety, and their future now depended entirely on the decisions of distant authorities who might not even remember their names. By the time the first hints of morning approached, many prisoners felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Surviving another night meant they had at least gained one more day of life. Yet they also knew that when the sun eventually set again, the same long hours of darkness and uncertainty would return once more. Most medieval prisons were underground dungeons located beneath castles, towers, city gates, or government buildings, and these locations shaped nearly every aspect of a prisoner's daily life. Unlike modern prisons, which are carefully designed with ventilation systems, beds, lighting, and sanitation, medieval dungeons were rarely planned with the health or comfort of prisoners in mind. They were usually repurposed as basements, storage chambers, or defensive vaults that had been built for completely different purposes long before anyone considered using them as prisons. Because of this, the environment inside these places was harsh, unhealthy, and deeply uncomfortable. For the people forced to live inside them, every moment became a struggle against cold, dampness, darkness, and physical exhaustion. The underground location of many medieval prisons meant that sunlight almost never reached the cells. Thick stone walls surrounded the chambers on every side, and only small openings near the ceiling sometimes connected the dungeon to the outside world. These narrow windows, if they existed at all, were often protected with iron bars and placed so high above the floor that prisoners could not reach them. Even when daylight filtered through these openings, the light was weak and faded quickly as it entered the dark interior. Most of the cell remained in shadow throughout the day, and by evening the darkness became almost complete. Living in such dim conditions had a powerful effect on prisoners. Human beings rely on light to regulate sleep, mood, and a sense of time, but inside a dungeon those natural rhythms often disappeared. Many prisoners struggled to know how much time had passed, especially if they had no access to sunlight or clocks. Days and nights blended together into a long stretch of discomfort that seemed endless. The structure of the dungeon itself contributed heavily to the misery prisoners experienced. Medieval castles and fortifications were built with extremely thick stone walls designed to resist attacks from outside enemies. These same walls trapped cold air inside the prison chambers, creating a chilling environment that was difficult to escape. During winter months, the temperature inside a dungeon could become painfully low. Stone absorbs cold easily, and without fireplaces or proper insulation, the interior of the prison often felt as cold as the ground beneath it. Prisoners who had been arrested suddenly rarely brought warm clothing with them. Many were left wearing the same clothes they had been captured in, which might be thin garments suitable for daytime work rather than for surviving long nights underground. Without blankets or proper bedding, prisoners often tried to conserve body heat by curling tightly into themselves or pressing against the walls where they believed warmth might exist. Sometimes prisoners slept close together simply to share body heat, especially in crowded cells where space was limited. Even so, the cold often seeped into their bones, making sleep restless and uncomfortable. In contrast, summer months created a different but equally unpleasant problem. Underground chambers tended to trap humidity and stale air. Without proper ventilation, the dungeon could become hot, damp, and suffocating. Moisture from the surrounding earth often seeped through the stone walls, creating patches of wetness that spread across the surfaces of the cell. Over time, this moisture encouraged the growth of mold and mildew, which produced a strong, unpleasant smell that filled the prison air. Breathing in such conditions day after day could make prisoners feel constantly sick or dizzy. Some experienced persistent coughing as their lungs reacted to the damp environment. Water infiltration was one of the most common problems inside medieval prisons. Because these dungeons were often built below ground level, rainwater and groundwater frequently found their way through cracks in the stone or gaps in the mortar. When it rained heavily outside, small streams of water might trickle down the walls and gather on the floor. In some prisons the floor was slightly sloped toward a drain or a corner, but many had no drainage at all. As a result, puddles formed across the stone surface and remained there for long periods of time. Prisoners forced to sit or lie on the floor often found themselves resting directly beside these damp patches. Their clothing became wet and uncomfortable, making it even harder to stay warm. The constant presence of moisture also created slippery surfaces that made moving around the cell dangerous. A prisoner who slipped or fell could easily injure themselves, and medical treatment inside prisons was almost non-existent. Even small injuries could become serious when combined with poor hygiene and a lack of care. Infections spread easily in such environments, and a simple cut or bruise might worsen quickly. The floor itself was another source of constant discomfort. Most dungeon floors were made of rough stone slabs laid directly over the earth. These surfaces were extremely hard, offering no softness or support for the human body. Modern people are used to sleeping on mattresses or at least padded surfaces, but medieval prisoners usually had nothing but the bare floor beneath them. In some cases guards provided a thin layer of straw, but this straw was rarely fresh. It was often reused by many prisoners over time and could be filled with dirt, insects, and unpleasant smells. As the straw broke down it became damp and compacted, offering little comfort. Prisoners lying on it still felt the hardness of the stone beneath. Because of this, many prisoners experienced constant body pain. Their backs, hips, and shoulders ached from sleeping on uneven surfaces. Without the ability to stretch or change position freely, especially if they were chained, the pain became a permanent part of daily life. Over time muscles stiffened and joints became sore, making simple movements increasingly difficult. The chains and restraints used inside medieval prisons added another layer of suffering. Not every prisoner was chained, but many were, especially those considered dangerous or those accused of serious crimes. Iron shackles were commonly placed around the ankles or wrists and connected by heavy chains to rings fixed into the wall or floor. These restraints limited how far a prisoner could move and often forced them to remain in a small area for long periods. The metal used for these shackles was cold and unforgiving. During winter it felt like ice against the skin, and during summer it could become uncomfortably warm. Because prisoners wore the shackles continuously, the metal rubbed against their skin whenever they moved. Over time this friction caused painful sores and cuts. Without proper cleaning or medical attention, these wounds sometimes became infected. Some prisoners tried to wrap cloth around the metal to protect their skin, but many had no spare cloth available. The clanking sound of chains was also a constant presence inside the dungeon. Whenever a prisoner shifted their position or attempted to stand, the metal links scraped against each other and echoed through the stone chamber. These sounds reminded everyone in the prison of their captivity. Even small movements created noise, making it difficult for prisoners to feel any sense of privacy or quiet. In crowded cells where several prisoners were chained together, the movement of one person could disturb everyone else nearby. This constant disturbance contributed to the lack of sleep that many prisoners experienced. Cleanliness inside medieval prisons was extremely poor. There were rarely dedicated facilities for washing or bathing, and prisoners often went weeks or months without proper hygiene. Dirt accumulated on their bodies and clothing, creating strong odors that filled the confined space. Sweat, dampness, and the natural decay of straw bedding combined to create an atmosphere that many people would find unbearable today. Prisoners quickly became accustomed to the smell because they had no choice, but the environment remained unhealthy and unpleasant. Personal belongings were also limited. When individuals were arrested, many of their possessions were taken away by guards or authorities. A prisoner might enter the dungeon with nothing more than the clothes they were wearing. Without tools, books, or other objects to occupy their time, boredom became another heavy burden. Hours stretched endlessly as prisoners sat in the darkness with little to do except think or speak with others nearby. Some tried to pass the time by telling stories or discussing events from their past lives, but such conversations could only last so long before silence returned. Another problem within these underground prisons was the presence of animals and pests. Rats were particularly common because they thrived in dark, damp environments where food scraps might occasionally appear. These rodents moved freely through cracks in the walls and across the floors of the cells. Prisoners often heard them scratching or squeaking in the darkness, and sometimes they ran directly over sleeping bodies while searching for food. For prisoners already exhausted and frightened, these encounters could be deeply disturbing. Insects were also widespread. Fleas, lice, and other small parasites found ideal living conditions in the dirty straw and unwashed clothing of prisoners. Once these insects appeared, they spread quickly among everyone sharing the same space. Prisoners scratched constantly at itchy bites that covered their skin. These irritations made it even harder to rest or sleep. The psychological effect of living in such conditions was powerful. Over time, prisoners began to feel less like human beings and more like forgotten objects hidden away beneath the earth. The darkness, the cold, the smell, and the constant discomfort created an environment where hope was difficult to maintain. Even strong and determined individuals could begin to feel defeated after weeks in such surroundings. Some prisoners tried to keep their spirits alive by talking about the outside world. They remembered sunlight, fresh air, open fields, or the simple comfort of a warm bed. These memories sometimes offered brief emotional relief, but they also reminded prisoners of everything they had lost. The contrast between their past lives and their current situation could feel overwhelming. For those who had families waiting outside, the thought of loved ones added both comfort and pain. They hoped to see them again one day, yet they also worried about how their imprisonment might affect them. Despite these terrible conditions, medieval prisons continued to function in this way for centuries. Authorities rarely invested resources into improving them because prisoners were not considered a priority. Society at the time viewed imprisonment primarily as a temporary stage before punishment or release, not as a long-term institution requiring humane conditions. As long as prisoners remained contained and could not escape, the basic purpose of the prison was considered fulfilled. For the men and women forced to endure these environments, however, the dungeon was far more than a holding space. It became the center of their entire existence, a place where every hour was shaped by cold stone, damp air, aching muscles, and the constant reminder that freedom existed somewhere far above their heads. Nighttime inside a medieval prison was rarely silent, even though the darkness often made the place feel empty and isolated. Once the limited activity of the day faded away and the guards reduced their movements through the corridors, a different kind of atmosphere emerged. Instead of the predictable sounds of footsteps, orders, and clanking doors that filled the prison during daylight hours, the night brought a mixture of strange, unsettling noises that echoed through the stone chambers. These sounds became a constant presence for the prisoners who lay awake in the darkness, often unable to sleep as they listened carefully to every movement around them. In such an environment, the human mind became extremely sensitive to noise. Even the smallest sound could feel amplified by the silence in the enclosed spaces of the dungeon. The thick stone walls reflected echoes back and forth, making it difficult to determine exactly where a sound originated. A noise that came from a distant corridor might seem as if it were happening just a few feet away, and a quiet scrape could transform into a disturbing echo that lingered long after the original sound had ended. One of the most common sounds heard in medieval prisons during the night was the movement of rats. These animals thrived in dark, damp environments where food scraps occasionally appeared, and prisons provided an ideal habitat for them. Once the guards and prisoners settled down and the corridors became quiet, the rats began their nightly activity. They slipped through cracks in the walls, crawled across the straw bedding, and scurried over the cold stone floors in search of anything they could eat. Prisoners lying on the ground could hear the soft scratching of tiny claws against the stone, followed by quick bursts of movement as the animals darted from one place to another. Sometimes the rats fought with each other over bits of food, producing sharp squeaks and rapid movements that startled anyone trying to sleep. For prisoners who were already frightened and exhausted, these sounds were deeply disturbing. The darkness prevented them from seeing where the animals were moving, which meant that every small noise could create a feeling of uncertainty. Some prisoners wrapped their arms around their bodies or pulled their legs closer to their chests to avoid contact with the rats. Others tried to chase them away by making sudden movements or noises, but the animals usually returned once the prisoner grew still again. Over time, many prisoners simply learned to live with the constant presence of these creatures, though the discomfort never truly disappeared. In addition to rats, the dungeon was filled with the quiet movements of other prisoners. In crowded cells, people often lay only a short distance from one another, and every shift in position produced sound. Someone turning over on the straw might cause dry stalks to crack softly beneath their weight. Another prisoner might cough, groan, or whisper in their sleep. Chains attached to wrists or ankles scraped against the stone floor whenever a prisoner tried to adjust their position. These sounds blended together into a restless background noise that continued throughout the night. Occasionally the silence would be broken by whispered conversations between prisoners who could not sleep. In the darkness, voices seemed strangely intimate, as if the speakers were sharing secrets that belonged only to that moment. Some prisoners used these conversations to distract themselves from fear. They spoke quietly about their past lives, their homes, their families, or the circumstances that had led to their arrest. A merchant might describe the busy markets of distant cities, while a soldier might tell stories of battles fought years earlier. These conversations sometimes lasted for hours as prisoners tried to keep their minds occupied. Yet even these moments of human connection could not fully overcome the sense of tension that filled the dungeon at night. Many prisoners listened to such conversations without joining them, lying silently while absorbing every word. Others avoided speaking altogether, either because they feared drawing attention to themselves or because they had lost the energy to interact with those around them. The uncertainty of the prison environment meant that friendships formed cautiously. No one could be completely sure of the intentions of the people sharing the same cell. Some prisoners had committed serious crimes, while others claimed complete innocence. In such circumstances, trust developed slowly, if at all. Among the most frightening sounds prisoners might hear during the night were those connected to interrogation or punishment taking place elsewhere in the prison. Many medieval castles and fortresses included dedicated rooms where authorities questioned prisoners suspected of serious crimes. These rooms were sometimes located close to the dungeon cells, separated only by a few thick walls or narrow corridors. Because stone carried sound so easily, prisoners lying in their cells could sometimes hear the events unfolding in those nearby chambers. The process usually began with the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor. Guards moving together produced a heavy rhythm as their boots struck the stone floor. Prisoners learned to recognize this pattern quickly, and the sound often caused immediate anxiety. Conversations stopped, bodies became still, and everyone listened carefully to determine whether the guards were passing by or stopping nearby. If the footsteps continued past the cell doors, prisoners might release a quiet breath of relief. But if the sound paused outside a door, tension filled the air. The rattling of keys was another unmistakable sound. Guards carried large rings of iron keys that clanked loudly whenever they moved. When those keys scraped against a lock and the metal mechanism turned, the noise echoed through the dungeon like a signal announcing that something important was about to happen. Sometimes the guards entered a cell and called out the name of a prisoner, ordering them to stand or prepare to be moved. Other times they dragged someone out by force, especially if the prisoner resisted. The scuffling of feet, the scrape of chains, and the sharp commands of the guards created a moment of chaos before the cell door slammed shut again. Once the prisoner was removed from the cell, the remaining inmates often listened closely to what followed. If the person being taken was led toward an interrogation chamber, the sounds of questioning could sometimes be heard later in the night. The details of such interrogations varied depending on the region and the authorities involved, but the experience was often harsh. Voices raised in anger, the thud of objects being moved, and the strained cries of the prisoner sometimes carried through the stone corridors. These sounds spread fear among those still waiting in their cells. Hearing another person suffer only a short distance away reminded them how fragile their own situation was. Even prisoners who had done nothing wrong worried that they might be accused or pressured into confessing to something they did not commit. In medieval legal systems, confession often played a major role in determining guilt, and authorities sometimes believed that strong methods were justified in order to obtain it. As a result, the sounds of interrogation became one of the most dreaded aspects of prison life. Some prisoners tried to block these noises from their minds by covering their ears or whispering prayers. Others lay silently, unable to ignore what they were hearing. The emotional effect could be profound. Listening to another person's pain created a deep sense of helplessness. Prisoners knew they could do nothing to intervene or protect the person being questioned. All they could do was wait and hope that they themselves would not be chosen next. Even when no interrogations were taking place, the prison still produced many strange sounds throughout the night. Water dripping from the ceiling or seeping through cracks in the wall created a steady rhythm that echoed across the chamber. Wind passing through narrow openings sometimes produced low whistling noises that sounded almost like distant voices. These natural sounds blended with the human noises of coughing, shifting chains, and quiet murmurs. For someone unfamiliar with the environment, the dungeon could feel almost haunted. The lack of light made every noise seem mysterious and unpredictable. Some prisoners began to imagine shapes or movements that were not really there, especially after spending many nights in near total darkness. Exhaustion and stress affected the mind in powerful ways. A person who had slept poorly for several days might find their thoughts becoming confused or distorted. Small sounds could trigger sudden fear, and shadows created by faint torchlight in the corridor might appear like moving figures along the walls. These psychological effects made nighttime particularly difficult to endure. Another unsettling sound was the sudden shouting or crying of prisoners who experienced nightmares or emotional breakdowns. The pressure of imprisonment, combined with the terrible conditions of the dungeon, sometimes pushed people beyond their mental limits. In the middle of the night, someone might suddenly wake up screaming, convinced they were being attacked or remembering a traumatic event from earlier in their life. These outbursts startled everyone in the cell and sometimes attracted the attention of guards, who might respond with anger or punishment if they believed the noise was intentional. After such incidents, the dungeon usually returned to silence, but the tension lingered long afterward. Through all of these experiences, the night seemed to stretch endlessly for the prisoners lying on the stone floor. Each sound became part of the strange rhythm of life inside the dungeon. The scratching of rats, the whispering of fellow prisoners, the distant footsteps of guards, and the occasional cries from interrogation chambers formed a soundscape that was both familiar and terrifying. For those trapped inside, these noises served as constant reminders that they were living in a place far removed from the ordinary world above ground. While towns and villages slept peacefully outside the prison walls, the people inside remained awake in the darkness, listening carefully to every echo and wondering what the next sound might bring. Food inside medieval prisons was scarce, poor in quality, and often barely enough to keep prisoners alive. For the people locked inside these dark stone cells, hunger was not just an occasional discomfort but a constant companion that followed them every hour of the day and night. Unlike modern prison systems where meals are scheduled regularly and designed to meet basic nutritional needs, medieval prisons provided food only in the most minimal sense. Authorities rarely felt responsible for properly feeding prisoners, especially those who were poor or accused of serious crimes. In many places, the expectation was that prisoners would rely on family members, friends, or charitable visitors to bring them food from the outside. Those who had no such support were forced to survive on whatever small rations the guards decided to give them. As evening approached inside a medieval prison, the daily ration usually arrived. For many prisoners, this was the only meal they would receive for the entire day. The food was simple and often unappealing. A piece of stale bread was the most common item, sometimes accompanied by a thin bowl of broth or watered-down soup. The broth might contain a few vegetables or scraps of meat if the prison happened to have access to them, but more often it was little more than flavored water. In some places, prisoners received small portions of porridge made from coarse grains such as barley or oats. While these foods could provide a small amount of energy, the portions were usually far too small to satisfy a hungry adult who had been sitting in a cold dungeon all day. The bread itself was often hard and dry because it had been baked many hours earlier and left sitting until the prisoners received it. Sometimes the bread was already beginning to spoil, especially in damp prison environments where mold spread easily. Prisoners who were starving rarely complained because even spoiled food was better than nothing. Many softened the bread by dipping it into their broth or soaking it in water so it could be chewed more easily. Those with damaged teeth or weak health sometimes struggled to eat it at all. Despite these difficulties, the arrival of the daily ration was one of the few predictable events in the life of a prisoner. The moment guards appeared carrying baskets or wooden bowls, prisoners paid close attention. In crowded cells, the distribution of food could quickly become chaotic. Guards often handed the food through the bars or pushed it into the cell without much concern for fairness. Stronger prisoners sometimes grabbed larger portions while weaker individuals received less. Arguments broke out frequently as people tried to protect their small share of the meal. Because hunger sharpened emotions, even minor disagreements could grow into heated confrontations. Some prisoners attempted to hide part of their bread for later in the night, knowing that hunger would become stronger as the hours passed. They might tuck a small piece into their clothing or place it carefully beside them on the straw. But hiding food was risky in a crowded cell where everyone was watching each other closely. If another prisoner discovered the hidden piece, it could easily be stolen while the owner slept or looked away. For this reason, many prisoners chose to eat their entire portion immediately, even though they knew the hunger would return before morning. Once the evening meal had been consumed, The long hours of night began with empty stomachs. Hunger had a powerful physical effect on the body. At first it created a dull, aching sensation in the stomach, a reminder that more food was needed. As time passed, the feeling became sharper and more distracting. Prisoners often found themselves thinking constantly about food, remembering the meals they used to enjoy before their imprisonment. A farmer might recall the taste of warm bread fresh from the oven, while a fisherman might think about the smell of roasted fish cooked over a fire. These memories were both comforting and painful, because they reminded prisoners of a life that now seemed very far away. Hunger also made the body feel weak and tired. Without enough nutrients, the muscles lost strength, and simple movements required more effort than usual. Prisoners who were already exhausted from poor sleep and harsh conditions sometimes felt dizzy or lightheaded. Their concentration faded, and conversations with other prisoners slowed as everyone tried to conserve what little energy remained. During cold nights, the lack of food made it even harder to stay warm, because the body needed fuel to maintain heat. As a result, many prisoners shivered continuously, wrapping their arms around themselves while trying to endure the long darkness. In overcrowded cells, the effects of hunger sometimes pushed people toward desperate behavior. When many hungry individuals were confined together in a small space with very limited resources, tension grew quickly. A prisoner who still had a piece of bread left might suddenly find another person trying to snatch it away. Arguments over food became common, especially late at night when the hunger felt strongest. Some prisoners formed small alliances with those they trusted, agreeing to share food if one of them happened to receive extra during the next distribution. These arrangements offered a small sense of security in an environment where resources were unpredictable. But not everyone could rely on cooperation. In many cases, the strongest or most aggressive prisoners dominated the cell. They took larger portions during the distribution of food and intimidated others into surrendering part of their ration. Weaker prisoners often had little choice but to comply, knowing that resisting might lead to violence. Because guards rarely monitored the cells closely during the night, such conflicts sometimes escalated without anyone intervening. A shove or insult could quickly turn into a fight as prisoners struggled over a few bites of bread. Even when violence did not occur, the tension remained heavy in the air as everyone guarded their small share of food carefully. The scarcity of food also changed the way prisoners thought about time. Instead of measuring the day by sunlight or activity, many measured it by the distance between meals. The evening ration marked the moment when the longest period of hunger was about to begin. As night continued, prisoners counted the hours until morning when they might receive another small portion. But the waiting was never easy. Hunger slowed the passage of time, making each hour feel longer than the last. Some prisoners attempted to distract themselves by talking, telling stories, or praying quietly, but the body's constant demand for food was difficult to ignore. The smell of food sometimes drifted into the dungeon from above, making the situation even worse. In castles or city prisons, kitchens were often located somewhere within the same building. When meals were prepared for soldiers, servants, or guards, the aroma of cooking meat, bread, or vegetables could travel through stairways and corridors into the prison below. For prisoners sitting in darkness with empty stomachs, these smells were almost unbearable. They reminded them that plenty of food existed just a short distance away, yet they had no access to it. Some prisoners closed their eyes and tried to imagine they were part of those meals again, sitting at a table with family or friends. Others became silent and bitter, feeling that the world above the dungeon had forgotten them completely. Occasionally, prisoners received food from visitors, which made a dramatic difference in their experience. Families or friends sometimes brought small baskets containing bread, fruit, cheese, or cooked dishes. When such food arrived, it was like a treasure. Prisoners who received these gifts often shared small portions with trusted companions, strengthening bonds within the cell. But not everyone had visitors, and those who lacked outside support watched these moments with mixed emotions. They felt happy for their fellow prisoners, yet painfully aware of their own isolation. Over time, the constant hunger affected both the body and the mind. Prisoners became thinner as their bodies used stored energy to survive. Clothing that once fit comfortably began to hang loosely. Faces grew pale and hollow as strength slowly faded. Mentally, hunger could make people irritable and impatient. Small disagreements that might have been ignored under normal circumstances suddenly felt important. Words spoken in frustration sometimes created lasting resentment between prisoners sharing the same cramped space. Despite these difficulties, people continued to endure. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt even to harsh conditions. Prisoners developed routines that helped them survive the nightly hunger. Some tried to chew their bread slowly, making the small portion last as long as possible. Others drank water to create a temporary feeling of fullness. Conversations about food became common, with prisoners describing recipes, meals from their childhood, or famous dishes from distant regions. These discussions served as a strange form of comfort, allowing them to remember flavors and experiences that once brought joy to their lives. Still, as the night grew deeper and the dungeon settled into uneasy silence, hunger remained present. It was a quiet but relentless force that shaped every thought and movement inside the prison. While the outside world slept comfortably after evening meals, the prisoners lay awake on the cold stone floor, their stomachs empty and their minds fixed on the simple wish for enough food to survive another day. Sanitation inside medieval prisons was extremely poor, and this lack of cleanliness created an environment where disease and suffering spread easily among the prisoners. Unlike modern facilities that include plumbing, waste disposal systems, and medical supervision, medieval prisons rarely provided even the most basic forms of hygiene. The people locked inside these dark chambers were forced to live for long periods in conditions that most would find unbearable. Dirt accumulated quickly, waste had nowhere proper to go, and the air became heavy with unpleasant smells that filled every corner of the dungeon. For prisoners trapped in such places, maintaining health was almost impossible. One of the most immediate problems prisoners faced was the lack of proper toilets. Most prison cells did not include any kind of dedicated sanitation facility. Instead, prisoners were often given a simple bucket or wooden container where they were expected to relieve themselves. In crowded cells, this bucket had to serve everyone, and it filled quickly. Guards were not always careful about emptying these containers regularly, especially during the night when supervision was minimal. When the bucket overflowed or was forgotten for too long, the waste sometimes spilled onto the floor, spreading unpleasant odors throughout the cell. In some prisons, the situation was even worse. Prisoners had no container at all and were forced to use a quarter of the floor for their bodily needs. Over time, this created a foul and unhealthy environment where waste soaked into the straw bedding and mixed with the dirt already present on the ground. The smell inside such a cell could become overwhelming, particularly during warm weather when the heat intensified the odor. Breathing the stale air day after day made prisoners feel constantly sick and uncomfortable. The lack of running water made the situation even more difficult. Prisoners rarely had opportunities to wash themselves or clean their surroundings. If water was provided, it was usually in small quantities meant only for drinking. Without water for washing, sweat and dirt remained on the body, creating layers of grime that built up over time. Clothing became stiff with dried sweat and dust. Skin grew itchy and irritated, especially in places where the rough fabric rubbed against the body. The combination of sweat, waste, and damp air created a strong smell that filled the entire dungeon. Prisoners often became accustomed to it simply because they had no way to escape it, but the air remained unhealthy to breathe. Personal hygiene became nearly impossible under these circumstances. Hair grew tangled and dirty, beards became thick and unkempt, and fingernails collected dirt from the environment. Prisoners sometimes tried to clean themselves using small amounts of water or by wiping their skin with bits of cloth, but these efforts could only do so much. Over time, many people inside the prison began to look and feel very different from how they had before their imprisonment. Their bodies showed clear signs of neglect and hardship. Insects thrived in these conditions. Fleas and lice were especially common in medieval prisons because they spread easily in crowded spaces where people rarely washed. These tiny parasites lived in clothing, straw bedding, and hair, feeding on human blood and multiplying quickly. Once they appeared inside a cell, it was almost impossible to get rid of them. Prisoners scratched constantly at the bites that covered their skin. The itching could become so intense that some people scratched until their skin broke, creating small wounds that sometimes became infected. Because the dungeon was damp and dirty, bacteria easily entered these cuts and caused further illness. The irritation from these insects made sleep even more difficult. A prisoner might lie down hoping to rest, only to feel sudden itching across their arms, neck, or legs. Swatting at the parasites provided only temporary relief, because more always appeared. Over time, the constant discomfort added to the overall exhaustion that prisoners already felt from hunger, cold, and fear. Rats also played a major role in spreading disease inside medieval prisons. These animals were attracted to the dark, damp environment and the occasional scraps of food left behind by prisoners. They nested in cracks within the walls or beneath piles of straw, emerging mostly at night to search for food. Their presence created both fear and danger. Rats could bite if they felt threatened, and their bodies carried fleas that spread illness. In many parts of medieval Europe, rats and their parasites were connected to devastating outbreaks of disease. Although people at the time did not fully understand how infections spread, they could clearly see that unhealthy environments like prisons often led to sickness. In addition to parasites and rodents, prisoners faced the threat of contagious diseases that spread rapidly in confined spaces. Dysentery was one of the most common illnesses. This disease caused severe stomach pain and constant diarrhea, which made the sanitation problem inside the cells even worse. When someone became sick with dysentery, their weakness increased quickly because their body lost water and nutrients. Without medical treatment, the illness could become deadly, especially for prisoners who were already weakened by hunger. Fever was another common problem. A prisoner might suddenly develop chills, headaches, and extreme fatigue. Because there were no doctors regularly visiting the cells, other prisoners could do little more than offer comfort or share water if they had any to spare. Watching a fellow prisoner struggle with fever was a frightening experience because everyone understood how easily sickness could spread in such close quarters. Coughing and breathing problems were also frequent due to the damp air and mold growing on the stone walls. Prisoners often heard each other coughing throughout the night, the sound echoing through the chamber again and again. Some coughs became deep and persistent, suggesting that the lungs had been affected by infection or prolonged exposure to cold and moisture. Over time, these illnesses could weaken a prisoner so much that even standing became difficult. In a place where survival already required strength and endurance, such weakness was extremely dangerous. Medical care inside medieval prisons was minimal or non-existent. Guards were rarely trained in medicine, and professional doctors were seldom called unless the prisoner was considered important or wealthy. Most prisoners had to rely on their own limited knowledge or on the advice of fellow inmates. Some people tried simple remedies, such as wrapping wounds with pieces of cloth or drinking extra water to ease fever, but these methods rarely solved the underlying problem. When disease spread through a prison cell, it often affected several people at once. Prisoners lying close together shared the same air, the same bedding, and sometimes even the same containers for food and water. Under these circumstances, illness moved quickly from one person to another. A single infected individual could unintentionally pass the sickness to everyone nearby. Within days, the entire cell might be filled with coughing, groaning, and the weak voices of people struggling to recover. For those who remained healthy, the constant presence of sickness created fear. They knew that at any moment they might begin to feel the same symptoms appearing in their own bodies. Watching someone grow weaker day by day reminded them how fragile life inside the prison truly was. Some prisoners tried to keep their spirits alive by offering quiet prayers or encouraging words to those who were ill. Religious faith played an important role for many people during the medieval period, and prayer often became a source of comfort in times of suffering. In the darkness of the dungeon, it was not unusual to hear someone whispering prayers for healing, forgiveness, or protection. These quiet moments sometimes created a sense of unity among prisoners who shared the same hardships. Even people who had never met before their imprisonment found themselves supporting each other simply because they were facing the same dangers together. Yet despite these small acts of kindness, the reality of illness inside medieval prisons remained harsh. Some prisoners recovered slowly after days or weeks of suffering, but others did not survive. When someone died inside the cell, their body might remain there for some time before guards came to remove it. This situation was deeply disturbing for the remaining prisoners, who had to sit near the lifeless body until it was finally taken away. Such moments reminded everyone inside the dungeon that their own survival was never guaranteed. Living in such unhealthy conditions for long periods changed both the physical and emotional state of the prisoners. Their bodies grew weaker, their skin showed signs of infection and insect bites, and their minds struggled to cope with the constant presence of sickness and decay. Still, many continued to endure, holding on to the hope that one day they might leave the dungeon behind and return to the open air of the outside world. Perhaps the most frightening part of the night inside a medieval prison was the deep uncertainty that surrounded every prisoner's future. Unlike modern legal systems where prisoners are usually informed about their charges, court dates, and possible outcomes, many people imprisoned during the medieval period had very little information about what would happen to them next. Once the heavy doors closed and the guards left the corridor in darkness, prisoners were left alone with their thoughts. In that quiet environment, the mind often returned again and again to the same troubling questions. How long would they remain here? Would they ever see freedom again? Would they be called for trial, or would punishment come without warning? These questions lingered in the darkness, growing heavier with each passing hour of the night. For many prisoners, the waiting itself became a form of suffering. Medieval justice systems were often slow and unpredictable. A person accused of a crime might remain imprisoned for days, weeks, or even months before their case was heard. In some situations, the authorities delayed trials simply because officials were busy with other matters such as wars, political disputes, or travel between distant regions. Courts were not always held regularly, and judges or rulers might only visit certain locations occasionally. As a result, prisoners sometimes spent long stretches of time in their cells without hearing any news about their case. This uncertainty made it difficult to maintain hope. A prisoner might wake each morning wondering if that would finally be the day when their fate would be decided. When nothing happened, they were forced to wait through another long night filled with anxious thoughts. The darkness of the dungeon made these worries feel even more intense. During daylight hours, prisoners could sometimes distract themselves by talking with others or observing the limited activity around them. But when night arrived and the prison fell quiet, their thoughts became louder. Without anything to occupy their minds, they began imagining every possible outcome. Some imagined being called before a judge who would listen carefully and eventually declare them innocent. Others feared a much darker possibility, believing that the next time the cell door opened, they might be taken away to face punishment. Because executions during the medieval period were often carried out quickly after a verdict, the idea of sudden death was never far from a prisoner's mind. One of the most powerful triggers of fear inside the prison was the sound of footsteps approaching through the corridor. Stone floors carried sound easily, and the slow rhythm of boots striking the ground echoed clearly through the dungeon halls. Prisoners learned to recognize these sounds immediately. Even those who had been resting or speaking quietly would suddenly fall silent as they listened. Everyone waited to see whether the footsteps would pass by or stop outside their cell. If the guards continued walking down the corridor, prisoners often felt a brief moment of relief. But if the steps slowed and the keys began to rattle, tension filled the entire space. The sound of keys scraping against metal locks was unmistakable. It meant that someone was about to be taken away. In that moment, every prisoner inside the cell felt a rush of fear, even if they tried to hide it. They wondered whose name the guards would call. Sometimes the guards already knew exactly which prisoner they wanted and called the name immediately. Other times they opened the door and looked around before choosing someone. The uncertainty made the moment feel even longer. Prisoners watched silently as the guards reached for one individual, ordering them to stand or pulling them to their feet if they hesitated. The chosen prisoner might ask questions about where they were being taken, but guards rarely offered clear answers. Instead, they simply commanded the prisoner to move. Chains rattled as the person was led out of the cell, their footsteps echoing down the corridor until the sound slowly disappeared. For the prisoners left behind, the silence that followed felt heavy and unsettling. They often wondered what would happen to the person who had just been taken away. In some cases, the prisoner was being brought before an official for questioning or trial. If that was the case, there was at least a possibility they might return later with news about their situation. But sometimes the guards were leading the prisoner toward punishment. In those moments, the remaining prisoners might never see that person again. This knowledge created a constant sense of dread. Each time the guards approached, everyone inside the dungeon wondered whether it might be their turn next. The fear of execution was particularly strong during the medieval era, because punishments for crimes could be extremely severe. Depending on the laws of the region and the nature of the offense, a person might face hanging, beheading, or other forms of public punishment. These executions were often carried out in front of crowds as a warning to others. Prisoners knew that if they were found guilty of certain crimes, they might soon be led out of the prison and into the daylight for the final time. Imagining that moment while sitting in darkness was almost unbearable. Some prisoners tried to prepare themselves mentally for the possibility, while others refused to think about it at all. Even those who believed they were innocent felt fear because they knew that medieval justice did not always operate fairly. A poor farmer accused by a powerful nobleman might struggle to defend themselves properly. A traveler arrested in a strange town might not have anyone willing to speak on their behalf. Witnesses could lie, misunderstandings could occur, and sometimes authorities simply made quick decisions in order to resolve cases rapidly. These realities made prisoners doubt whether truth alone would be enough to save them. During the long hours of the night, many prisoners thought about their lives before imprisonment. Memories of family members often appeared most strongly during these moments. A father might imagine his children wondering where he had gone. A wife might think about the husband she hoped to see again. These memories brought comfort but also deep sadness. Prisoners worried about how their absence affected the people they loved. In some cases, families struggled financially because the imprisoned person had been the main worker providing food or income. Knowing this created a heavy emotional burden for prisoners who felt powerless to help those waiting outside the prison walls. Despite these fears, some prisoners continued to hold on to hope. Hope could come from many sources. A prisoner might believe that a friend or relative was trying to gather money to pay a fine or bribe the guards for release. Others hoped that a judge would eventually recognize their innocence once the facts were properly explained. There were even cases where rulers granted pardons during special events such as religious celebrations or political changes. Stories about such pardons sometimes circulated among prisoners, giving them a small reason to remain optimistic. In the darkness of the dungeon, hope and fear existed side by side, constantly competing for control over the mind. Religion also played a major role in how prisoners dealt with uncertainty. Many people during the medieval period had strong faith in divine justice and believed that their suffering might have spiritual meaning. Some prisoners spent long hours praying quietly, asking for forgiveness for any mistakes they had made in their lives. Others prayed for protection or guidance, trusting that a higher power would eventually bring justice even if human authorities failed to do so. These prayers echoed softly through the cell as prisoners whispered words learned from childhood. For a moment, the dungeon felt less lonely as individuals shared the same act of faith in the darkness. As the night slowly moved toward morning, exhaustion began to affect everyone in the cell. After hours of worrying and listening for sounds in the corridor, prisoners often felt mentally drained. Some eventually drifted into uneasy sleep, while others remained awake until the first faint signs of daylight appeared. When morning finally arrived and the guards returned to begin another day of routine activity, many prisoners felt a quiet sense of relief. Surviving another night meant they had been granted one more day of life, yet the uncertainty remained. They knew that when the sun set again and darkness returned to the prison corridors, the same fears would rise once more, waiting in the shadows of the dungeon where no one could escape the question of what fate might come next. As the first signs of morning slowly approached, the atmosphere inside the medieval prison began to change in subtle ways. The darkness that had filled every corner of the dungeon during the night did not disappear suddenly. Instead, it slowly weakened as a faint gray light began to filter through the narrow openings high in the stone walls. For prisoners who had spent hours lying awake on the cold floor, this weak light felt almost like a small victory. It meant they had survived another night in a place where survival was never guaranteed. Many prisoners remained awake long before the sun actually rose. After a night filled with restless thoughts, strange noises, and constant discomfort, true sleep was rare. Some prisoners had managed to drift into short periods of rest, but even then they were often awakened by the movement of others, the sound of chains scraping against stone, or the distant footsteps of guards beginning their morning duties. As the dungeon slowly shifted from night toward day, prisoners began to stir around the cell. Bodies stiff from sleeping on the hard floor moved carefully as people stretched aching limbs and tried to ease the pain in their backs and joints. The first sounds of the morning usually came from the corridors outside the cells. Guards returning to their posts could be heard walking through the prison, their boots striking the stone floors with steady rhythm. Keys clanked against metal rings as they prepared to unlock doors or inspect the prisoners. These familiar sounds signaled that the quiet isolation of the night was ending, and that the routine of another difficult day was about to begin. For many prisoners, hearing the guards again brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it meant that the long night of uncertainty had passed without them being taken away. They were still alive, still waiting, and still holding on to whatever hope they had left. On the other hand, the return of the guards also reminded them that their fate remained in the hands of others. At any moment a name could be called, a door could open, and a prisoner could be led away to face questioning, punishment, or judgment. Inside the cells, prisoners often spoke quietly with each other as the morning light slowly strengthened. Conversations that had been whispered during the night became slightly more relaxed now that the darkness was fading. Some people shared their fears from the night before, while others discussed rumors they had heard about upcoming trials or changes in the prison. In places where prisoners had spent many days together, these morning conversations sometimes became an important part of their daily routine. They offered a small sense of normal life within an environment that was otherwise harsh and uncertain. Physical discomfort, however, remained constant. The cold stone floors had left many prisoners sore and exhausted. Some rubbed their arms or legs to restore circulation, while others sat quietly against the walls trying to gather enough strength to stand. Hunger also returned quickly in the morning hours. After going through the entire night with little or no food, prisoners felt the familiar emptiness in their stomachs. They waited to see whether the guards would bring another small ration of bread or porridge to help them begin the day. For prisoners who had endured many nights in the dungeon, the arrival of morning sometimes brought a strange sense of resilience. They had learned that survival inside a medieval prison required patience and endurance more than anything else. Each day that passed meant they had managed to hold on a little longer. Some began to think of their time in prison not in terms of hours but in terms of nights survived. One more night endured meant they had proven their strength once again. Yet the relief of morning never lasted long. Prisoners knew that as the day continued, the same fears and uncertainties would follow them. Guards might return with orders to move someone to another cell, to begin an interrogation, or to prepare a prisoner for trial. News from the outside world was rare, and every rumor carried through the corridors could either raise hopes or destroy them completely. Still, the brief appearance of daylight provided something the night never could, a reminder that the world outside the prison walls still existed. Through the narrow openings above their heads, prisoners sometimes caught a glimpse of the sky or heard distant sounds from the town beyond the fortress walls. Birds calling in the morning air, carts rolling along the streets, or distant voices from people beginning their daily work all served as reminders that life continued beyond the dungeon. For those trapped below ground, these small signs of the outside world were powerful. They reminded prisoners that the prison was only a small part of a much larger world filled with sunlight, fresh air, and freedom. Even if they could not reach it yet, the knowledge that it still existed helped some prisoners hold on to hope. And so, as the weak morning lights slowly filled the dungeon and the guards began their daily routines, the prisoners prepared themselves to endure another day inside the harsh stone walls. They knew that when evening came and darkness returned, the same fears, sounds, and struggles of the night would rise again. But for now, the simple fact that morning had arrived was enough to remind them that they had survived once more.